You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your Server Plus certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Basic input-output system and unified extensible firmware interface platforms serve as the foundational layer of server control. They handle boot sequencing, device detection, and low-level system configuration before the operating system loads. Because these interfaces execute first and have direct access to hardware, they pose a security risk if left unprotected. Unauthorized users can manipulate settings to bypass operating system security, boot unauthorized images, or erase configuration data. For the Server Plus certification, understanding how to lock down these interfaces is essential to maintaining system integrity. The distinction between basic input-output system and unified extensible firmware interface impacts what controls are available. Basic input-output system represents legacy firmware with a simple, keyboard-controlled menu. Unified Extensible Firmware Interface provides a graphical interface and advanced features such as secure boot and support for larger disks. Both interfaces support password protection, but only Unified Extensible Firmware Interface supports modern security extensions like measured boot or platform key management. Administrators must recognize the capabilities and limitations of each. Several types of passwords can be applied within the firmware interface. A setup password, also known as an administrator password, restricts access to configuration changes. A power-on password, also called a user password, must be entered before the system will boot. Some platforms allow drive-level passwords to prevent unauthorized access to specific storage devices. Each password type serves a different role and may be enabled or disabled independently depending on the server's use case and threat model. To enable passwords in the firmware interface, the administrator must enter setup mode during system startup. This is typically achieved by pressing a designated key, such as function 2, delete, or escape during the boot sequence. Once inside the interface, the administrator navigates to the security menu and sets the desired passwords. Strong passwords or passphrases should be used, incorporating sufficient length and complexity to resist brute force guessing. Passwords must also be stored securely to prevent accidental lockouts. One of the most important reasons for enabling a firmware password is to prevent unauthorized changes to the boot sequence. Without a password, an attacker could simply boot from an external device such as a universal serial bus drive or over the network using pre-boot execution environment. This would allow them to bypass the installed operating system and launch recovery tools or wipe the drive. Passwords ensure that the boot configuration cannot be changed without approval. Firmware interfaces often include controls for hardware-level access restrictions. For example, unused universal serial bus ports can be disabled to prevent unauthorized data transfers. Network interface cards can be selectively enabled or disabled. Audio ports or wireless controllers can be turned off entirely. These controls serve as part of a defense-in-depth strategy by reducing the number of accessible attack surfaces during and after boot. Secure boot is a feature available in unified extensible firmware interface platforms that prevents unsigned or tampered bootloaders from running. This is a powerful defense against rootkits or low-level malware that can install themselves before the operating system loads. Password protection is essential here, as it prevents attackers from disabling secure boot or replacing the trusted key database without authorization. This is a critical feature for modern server environments. Firmware passwords carry operational risk if they are lost or forgotten. Without the correct credentials, administrators may be locked out of configuration settings, delaying maintenance or recovery. Some motherboard manufacturers include a jumper setting or internal backdoor for password resets. Others require proof of ownership and a vendor-specific unlock code. To avoid disruption, passwords should be recorded in a secured and access-controlled credential management system. During periodic security assessments, administrators should review firmware security settings as part of the baseline. This includes confirming that passwords are set, verifying the secure boot state, and ensuring no unauthorized changes have been made. After a firmware update or motherboard replacement, these settings should be checked again. Including these elements in the hardening checklist improves overall system assurance and audit readiness. Firmware flashing, or updating the basic input-output system image, presents a significant security concern. If this process is not controlled, an attacker could flash a malicious image or corrupt the firmware entirely. Many platforms allow the administrator to lock firmware update capability or restrict it to trusted sources. Update images must always be validated with checksums and obtained only from trusted vendors. Unauthorized flashing can render systems unbootable or open permanent security holes. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Some firmware platforms include logging capabilities that track changes to settings or record boot events. These logs can indicate when a password was changed, when secure boot was disabled, or when a device boot sequence was modified. Reviewing these logs is important after hardware service or when system tampering is suspected. Alerting systems can be configured to notify administrators of changes in firmware configuration or unexpected reboots with altered settings. Password quality and rotation policies must apply to firmware credentials, just as they do for operating system accounts. Weak passwords such as admin, password, or simple numeric strings are easily guessed and undermine the protection they are meant to provide. During staff changes or scheduled audits, firmware passwords should be rotated and resecured. Password storage must use access-controlled vaults with proper logging and dual control to prevent unauthorized disclosure. Enterprise-grade server platforms often include features that allow remote access to firmware settings. These capabilities are usually delivered through management interfaces such as Intelligent Platform Management Interface or Integrated Lights Out. While remote access can simplify administration, it also introduces risk if not properly secured. Remote firmware management must be tightly restricted using secure channels, multi-factor authentication, and logging. Administrators should verify what capabilities are enabled and ensure remote flashing or reconfiguration is blocked when unnecessary. The interaction between firmware and full disk encryption solutions must be carefully managed. Features like Trusted Platform Module or Secure Boot can affect the operation of encryption tools such as BitLocker. Disabling these features in the firmware may prevent the operating system from accessing encrypted drives. Conversely, incorrect settings may cause boot errors or disable protection entirely. Coordination between firmware and operating system security settings ensures encryption solutions remain active and functional. Resetting firmware passwords varies by hardware vendor and may involve different procedures or support requirements. Some systems allow resets via physical jumpers on the motherboard. Others may require submission of a serial number and proof of ownership to receive a reset key. Rarely, a full return merchandise authorization may be required. Documentation of reset procedures should be maintained per hardware type and vendor to avoid downtime during lockouts. Firmware vulnerabilities are not theoretical. Attackers have exploited weak firmware to implant persistent malware, disable protections, or establish hardware-level backdoors. As a result, firmware patching must be treated with the same importance as operating system or application updates. Administrators should subscribe to vendor security bulletins, track firmware versions, and document patch history. Patching must occur in a controlled manner with testing and rollback options. In virtualized environments, firmware settings also play a role in system security. Virtual machine firmware, whether basic input-output system or unified extensible firmware interface, can control boot device access, secure boot status, and guest operating system isolation. Hypervisors should enforce policies that lock or hide firmware menus, especially for template or clone deployments. This prevents users from booting unauthorized operating system images or bypassing access controls using boot media. Firmware passwords are a critical component of securing the foundation of every server. Without these protections, attackers may compromise the system before the operating system even begins to execute. Proper use of administrative, user, and drive passwords helps preserve the chain of trust from power on through full system operation. In the next episode, we will continue this hardware protection theme by exploring how bootloader passwords can further secure the transition between firmware and the operating system kernel. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.